The farm sat on the edge of town, not too big and not too small, just enough land to grow vegetables, raise a few chickens, and keep life going. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't easy, but to her, it was everything. The black single mother, named Mariah, had poured her heart into that piece of land. Every morning before the sun rose, she was already outside, pulling on her worn boots, tying her hair back, and stepping into the field with determination. The air smelled of damp earth and dew, and the sky glowed faintly as the day began. Mariah was raising 2 children on her own, and the farm was their lifeline. Every tomato she planted, every egg she collected, every basket of vegetables she sold at the market meant food on the table and school shoes for her kids. It wasn't the kind of life people envied. There were no vacations, no expensive cars, no nights out in restaurants. But it was honest, and it was hers. She was proud of that. Still, the work was exhausting. Her hands were rough and calloused from the soil. Her back ached from bending over rows of crops. There were days when the rain refused to come, and the ground cracked beneath her feet. Other times, storms tore through, flattening her hard work in a single night. Yet she never stopped. She kept going because quitting was never an option. Her children needed her, and she had promised herself long ago that she would never let them feel abandoned or unloved. The house on the farm was old, its paint peeling, its roof patched too many times to count. But inside it was warm, filled with love. The kitchen always smelled of cornbread or stew, simple meals cooked with whatever she could grow or afford. At night, her children did homework at the kitchen table while she planned the next day's chores. Sometimes, she stayed up long after they went to bed, sewing clothes or repairing tools because she couldn't afford to buy new ones. The struggle wasn't just the hard work of farming. It was the loneliness, too. Raising children alone meant every decision, every burden, every worry sat squarely on her shoulders. There was no partner to lean on, no one to share the weight of the bills, the broken machinery, or the endless labor. She carried it all. And though she hid it well from her children, there were nights she sat by herself, tears slipping down her cheeks as she wondered how much longer she could hold everything together. People in town respected her from a distance, but they didn't always understand her. Some whispered about why she was alone. Others assumed she was struggling because she had chosen the wrong path. But Mariah ignored them. She knew her worth, and she knew her children's future depended on her strength. Every insult, every judgment, she buried under her steady rhythm of work. The farm was not only her source of income, it was her symbol of independence. Others might have doubted her, but she had proved she could keep the land alive on her own. That land carried her history. Her father had taught her how to plant rows straight, how to care for animals, how to respect the earth. When he passed, the farm became her inheritance, not in money, but in lessons of grit and endurance. Letting it go would mean letting go of everything he had taught her, everything she had worked for. Her children, though still young, understood the sacrifices she made. They helped when they could, feeding the chickens, pulling weeds, or carrying baskets of produce. On weekends, they joined her at the market, watching proudly as she sold their vegetables. "Mama's strong," they would whisper to each other. And she was. To them, she was more than just a mother. She was their protector, their provider, their role model. But even as she stood strong for them, the cracks were starting to show. Money was always tight. Repairs were constant. She had to fight tooth and nail just to keep the farm afloat. And though she never said it out loud, fear lingered in her mind. Fear that one mistake, one bad season, one stroke of bad luck could take it all away. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the fields, she stood on the porch looking out at her land. The chickens clucked softly, the rows of vegetables stretched quietly under the fading light, and her children's laughter drifted from the house. She breathed it all in, both the beauty and the burden. It was a hard life, yes, but it was hers. She didn't know that trouble was already on its way. She didn't know that soon, strangers in uniform would turn her quiet farm into a battlefield of intimidation and injustice. For now, she only knew the rhythm of her struggle. Wake, work, endure, repeat. And though the struggle was heavy, she carried it with pride, because every seed she planted, every meal she cooked, every scar on her hands told the same story. She was surviving, and she was not giving up. At first, the signs of trouble were small. A patrol car parked across the dirt road, its lights off, but its presence heavy. The officers inside pretended to be checking maps or radios, but Mariah felt their eyes on her as she worked in the field. A week later, they returned, this time driving slowly along the property line, their windows rolled down, staring at the crops and the old farmhouse as though they were searching for something wrong. Mariah tried to ignore it. She told herself they were just passing through, that she was imagining the extra seconds their eyes lingered on her land. But deep down, she knew better. She had lived long enough to recognize when people were looking for reasons to cause trouble. Soon, the visits became more frequent. Officers would pull into her driveway unannounced, stepping out of their cars with clipboards in hand. They asked endless questions. Was the land really hers? Did she have the right permits for the animals? Were her fences up to code? Each time, Mariah answered politely, showing them paperwork, pointing out that nothing was wrong. Still, they scribbled notes as if hunting for something she had missed. The pressure built like storm clouds gathering in the distance. Letters arrived in the mail, fines for minor infractions that seemed almost invented. One claimed her barn door was unsafe, another accused her of storing too much feed. She shook her head at the absurdity, knowing other farms in the area did the same without trouble. Yet somehow, she was the one singled out. Her children began to notice. "Mama, why are the police here again?" her daughter asked one afternoon as two officers walked across the yard. Mariah forced a smile and replied softly, "They're just checking things, baby. Don't worry." But inside, her chest tightened. She hated that her children had to see this, that the place meant to be their sanctuary was becoming a target. The community's whispers didn't help. At the market, she overheard neighbors muttering, "Maybe she's hiding something. You know how those things go. Where there's smoke, there's fire." People who once bought her vegetables now passed by her stand without stopping, their eyes avoiding hers. Fear spread quickly, and with fear came distance. Mariah refused to bow under the weight of suspicion. Every morning she rose early, worked her fields, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity. But the pressure was building, pressing against her from all sides. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random, that someone had decided her farm, her family, her life would be their target. The stress seeped into every part of her day. At night, when the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with stacks of letters, fines, and official notices spread before her. The papers seemed to multiply, each one more threatening than the last. She tried to fight back, filing appeals, making calls, explaining patiently that she was following the rules, but her voice was often met with silence or cold dismissal. Sleep became rare. Her mind ran in circles, wondering how much longer she could withstand it. The farm was her only source of income. If they found a way to shut it down, what would happen to her children? To their home? To everything she had fought to protect? The land itself seemed to feel the weight. The soil was ready for planting, but Mariah hesitated. What if she invested her energy and money only to have it ripped away by another fine, another raid? The animals grew restless too, sensing her unease. The cluck of chickens and the bleating of goats echoed in the stillness of her long nights, reminders of the fragile balance she was trying to hold together. The cops didn't slow down. Their visits became bolder. Once they pulled her over on the way to town, demanding to search the back of her truck. All they found were vegetables for the market, but the humiliation lingered long after they waved her on. Another time, they entered her property without permission, pacing around her barn as if it were a crime scene. Her children clung closer to her each time the flashing lights appeared at the gate. They were too young to understand the details, but old enough to feel the fear. Her son asked quietly one night, "Mama, are we in trouble?" She pulled him into her arms, whispering, "No, baby, we've done nothing wrong." But as she rocked him to sleep, her eyes burned with unshed tears. Mariah's strength was undeniable, but even the strongest shoulders have limits. The weight of being mother, farmer, provider, and now defender was crushing. She felt herself bending under it, close to breaking. And yet she carried on. She planted seeds, tended her animals, cooked dinner, and tucked her children into bed. She endured the pressure in silence, her pride refusing to let the world see her crumble. Still, she knew she couldn't carry it alone forever. Every knock on the door, every letter in the mailbox, every patrol car creeping down her road pushed her closer to a breaking point. She whispered prayers into the night, asking for strength, asking for protection, asking for someone to stand beside her. She didn't know that someone was already on his way. The pressure that once felt like a shadow on the horizon now stormed onto Mariah's farm with full force. The quiet patrol cars that lingered on the dirt road had turned into flashing lights in her driveway, and the polite questions that once pretended to be routine checks became loud demands. The officers no longer came alone. They arrived in pairs or groups, their boots crunching across her gravel drive, as though the land already belonged to them. One Saturday morning, Mariah was out in the garden with her children, pulling weeds and tending to the young tomato plants. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, rare moments of peace that reminded her why she worked so hard. Then the sound of engines shattered the calm. 2 police cars rolled up, kicking up clouds of dust that settled heavily on the green rows of crops. Her children fell silent, their small hands frozen mid-task. "Mama?" her daughter whispered, fear already creeping into her voice. "It's all right, baby," Mariah said softly, though her chest tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood tall as the officers climbed out, their belts heavy with weapons, their eyes cold. "Routine inspection," one of them said curtly, though he offered no papers, no explanation. They marched toward the barn, ignoring Mariah's questions. She followed quickly, her voice steady but firm. "You can't just walk onto my property without a warrant." One officer smirked. "Lady, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." The children watched from the porch, their eyes wide as the men yanked open the barn doors, peering inside, scribbling notes as if they had already decided something was wrong. They examined the feed bags, tapped on the wooden beams, even lifted lids off storage bins, searching for an excuse to call her guilty. Mariah stood with her arms crossed, her chin high, refusing to let them see her fear. But inside, anger and helplessness churned. This was her land, her family's sanctuary, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal in front of her own children. The harassment didn't stop there. The following week, she was stopped in town while driving her pickup truck. Groceries rattled in the back seat as the flashing lights appeared behind her. She pulled over, her hands steady on the wheel, her children whispering nervously in the back. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered. "Why? What did I do?" she asked. "Step out." They searched the truck from front to back, pawing through bags of flour and milk, inspecting the baskets of eggs she had just purchased. They found nothing, of course. There was nothing to find, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the show of power, the reminder that they could disrupt her life whenever they chose. Back at the farm, letters continued arriving in thick envelopes stamped with official seals, threats of fines, threats of eviction, threats that dripped with legal jargon designed to frighten and confuse. Each night, after putting her children to bed, Mariah sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, staring at the piles of papers that seemed to multiply with every sunrise. Her neighbors began to avoid her entirely now. Once friendly faces at the market turned cold. Some crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Others pretended not to notice her at all. Fear spread like fire, and no one wanted to be caught standing too close to the woman the police had marked. The harassment reached a cruel peak one rainy afternoon. Thunder rumbled overhead as 3 police cars pulled into the muddy driveway. The officers stepped out in their raincoats, their radios crackling, their boots sinking into the soaked earth. Without a word, they began snapping pictures of the farm, the house, even the children's bicycles left leaning against the porch. Mariah rushed outside, shielding her children who clung to her skirt. "You can't do this!" she shouted over the storm. Her voice was strong, but her heart was breaking. "This is our home. We've done nothing wrong." One officer looked at her with a smirk, raindrops running down his face. "We'll see about that." The cameras clicked, the children cried, and Mariah stood in the rain, refusing to back down even as her world seemed to close in tighter around her. That night, after the officers finally left, she sat in her kitchen soaked and exhausted, her children asleep upstairs. She stared out the window at the muddy tracks their tires had left in her yard. The farm, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear, something else flickered. A fire. A memory of her brother, the one person in the world who had always believed in her, who had always stood tall no matter the odds, a man forged by discipline, loyalty, and battlefields far from home. She hadn't called him yet, not wanting to burden him with her troubles, but as the storm raged outside and her farm lay bruised under the weight of harassment, she realized she couldn't carry this alone much longer. The cops thought they could break her, but they hadn't met him yet, and when he arrived, everything would change. The farm had always been a quiet corner of the community. People used to wave as they drove past, and neighbors sometimes stopped by to trade eggs for bread or to share extra seeds at planting time. Mariah had believed that even if life was hard, at least she was part of a community that valued hard work and honesty. But after the police began circling her land like hawks, the warmth she once felt from her neighbors began to cool. At first, it was small things. A familiar face at the market no longer stopped to chat. Someone who once smiled at her kids now looked away as though distracted. It was subtle enough that Mariah tried to dismiss it. "They're just busy," she told herself. "They don't mean anything by it." But the distance grew harder to ignore. When she set up her stand at the Saturday market, fewer people stopped by to buy her produce. Some walked past quickly, their eyes avoiding hers. Others whispered to each other, their voices just low enough that she couldn't hear the words, but high enough to sting. Her children noticed too. One afternoon, her son tugged on her apron while she packed up unsold baskets of vegetables. "Mama, why doesn't Mr. Jenkins buy our tomatoes anymore? He always used to." Mariah forced a smile, though her heart ached. "Maybe he grew his own this year," she said gently, but she knew the truth. People were afraid. The cops' constant presence around her farm had created rumors. People in town began to wonder why officers spent so much time on her land. They whispered that maybe she was hiding something, that maybe she wasn't as honest as she seemed. Fear and gossip spread like weeds, choking out the trust she had once built. At the feed store, she overheard two women talking in hushed tones. "I heard they found something out there," one said. The other replied, "Well, the police don't go after people for no reason." Mariah stood in the next aisle, her hands trembling around the bag of seed she held. She wanted to scream that she had done nothing wrong, that the farm was clean, that the only things she grew were vegetables and hope. But she said nothing. Her silence felt like a shield, though it was thin and fragile. The isolation deepened when her neighbors stopped lending small kindnesses. Where once they had offered to watch her children for an hour or to lend her a tool, now they crossed the road when she walked by. The children's friends stopped coming over to play. Invitations to community gatherings no longer reached her door. Even in church, where she once found comfort, she felt eyes on her. People shifted uncomfortably in the pews, offering tight smiles but no warmth. The pastor prayed about those among us who struggle with the truth. And though he never said her name, Mariah felt the weight of every glance that flicked her way. Her children bore the cruelty too. At school, her daughter came home one afternoon with tears streaking her cheeks. "They said the police come to our house because you're a criminal," she sobbed. Mariah pulled her close, stroking her hair, whispering, "That's not true, baby. Don't you believe them?" But her chest ached with fury. She could endure the whispers aimed at her, but watching them wound her children cut deeper than any insult. Nights grew lonelier. After the kids were asleep, Mariah sat by the window, staring out at the fields lit by the moon. The farm was still beautiful, still alive, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a battlefield. The silence that once comforted her now weighed heavy with absence, the absence of support, of friendship, of trust. Her phone, once buzzing with neighbors asking for eggs or vegetables, now stayed silent. The sense of belonging she had clung to for years was slipping away, replaced by the hollow chill of isolation. She was still in the community, but no longer part of it. And yet, she refused to crumble. She told herself every morning as she laced her boots, "I've faced worse. I can face this too." She worked harder, planting more rows, tending more carefully, as though proving to herself and to the watching world that she would not be broken. Still, the loneliness pressed on her shoulders like a heavy sack. She prayed quietly at night, asking for strength, asking for justice, asking for someone to stand by her side. That someone was her brother. He was far away, living a life shaped by discipline and danger, serving in special forces. She hadn't wanted to call him, hadn't wanted to burden him with her struggles. But as the community turned colder, as the walls closed in tighter, she began to think of him more and more. His voice, steady and calm, his presence, strong and unyielding. She whispered his name into the dark one night as her children slept, and though she didn't know it yet, that whisper was the beginning of change. Because family doesn't turn away, even when the world does, and her brother, her soldier, was about to remind everyone of that truth. The weight of the world seemed to grow heavier on Mariah's shoulders with each passing day. The farm, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison watched by strangers in uniform. The community had turned cold, the police grew bolder, and even the market, her only source of steady income, was drying up as customers drifted away. Every night she counted her dollars at the kitchen table, the numbers never enough to cover both the fines that kept arriving in the mail and the food her children needed. Her children tried to be strong, but their eyes betrayed them. Her son no longer asked if they were in trouble. Instead, he sat in silence, his little hands clenched into fists when the red and blue lights appeared at their gate. Her daughter stayed close to her side, flinching whenever she saw a patrol car on the road. Mariah's pride had carried her far, but pride alone could not fight an entire system pressing against her. She had promised herself years ago that she would never call her brother for help. He had his own battles, his own burdens. He served in the special forces, a life that took him to dangerous places she barely wanted to imagine. She never wanted to add her struggles to the weight he already carried. But one night, after another long day of harassment, she broke. It was nearly midnight. The house was quiet except for the soft breathing of her children asleep upstairs. Papers lay scattered across the kitchen table, fines, warnings, notices stamped with official seals. Her hands shook as she tried to organize them, but the letters blurred through her tears. Outside, the farm lay silent under the moon, but Mariah felt no peace, only fear. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over his name in her contacts list. She hesitated, whispering to herself, "Don't bother him. He's done enough already." But then she remembered her children's frightened faces, the cameras clicking in the rain, the humiliation of being searched in front of strangers. She realized she could no longer carry it alone. Her finger tapped the screen. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. She almost hung up, her breath shallow. Then a deep voice answered, steady and calm, even at that late hour. "Mariah?" Her tears spilled instantly. "It's me," she whispered. "I didn't want to call, but I don't know what else to do." There was no judgment in his tone, only concern. "Tell me," he said. And she did. The words poured out in a rush about the police cars, the fines, the inspections, the community turning its back. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it cracked under the weight of everything she had been holding back for months. "They're trying to take everything from me," she said, her voice breaking. "The farm, the kids' peace, our life. I've done nothing wrong, but they won't stop." For a moment there was silence on the other end. She feared maybe she had asked too much, but then his voice came through, calm and firm, like steel wrapped in warmth. "Mariah, listen to me. You are not alone anymore. You've carried this long enough. I'm coming." Her heart thudded. "But you're so far—" "I don't care," he interrupted gently but firmly. "I'll be there soon, and when I arrive, they will not touch you again. That's a promise." The relief that washed over her was overwhelming. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was standing against the world by herself. She closed her eyes, gripping the phone tightly, whispering, "Thank you. I didn't want to call, but thank you." "You should have called sooner," he said softly. "Family doesn't let family fight alone." When the call ended, Mariah sat in silence for a long time, staring at the moonlight spilling across her kitchen floor. Her tears were still flowing, but they were different now. They weren't just tears of fear, they were tears of hope. She didn't know exactly when he would arrive, or what would happen when he did, but she knew one thing for certain. The battle was no longer hers alone. Her brother was coming. A man who had faced danger, who had walked into war zones and returned stronger. A man who carried discipline in his bones and courage in his blood. And though she didn't say it out loud, she felt something rise inside her chest for the first time in a long while. Strength. Not just hers, but shared. The farm was still under siege. The community still distant. The police still circling like wolves. But now, there was a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. She could almost hear his footsteps already, steady and unyielding, crossing the distance between them. Mariah whispered into the quiet, "They don't know what's coming." And she was right. Because soon, the farm would no longer belong to a single mother standing alone. It would belong to a family united. And when her brother arrived onto the scene, everything would change. The morning after the call felt different, though the farm looked the same. The field still stretched wide under the pale dawn sky. The chickens clucked restlessly in the coop, and the old farmhouse creaked in the cool air. Yet Mariah sensed something stirring, a shift she couldn't explain. For the first time in months, she woke with a flicker of hope instead of dread. Her children noticed it too. At breakfast, her daughter asked, "Mama, why are you smiling?" Mariah only shook her head, hiding her secret like a flame she wanted to protect. "Just thinking," she said softly, though inside she whispered, "He's coming." By late afternoon, the sound of a vehicle rolling down the dirt road broke the silence. It wasn't the sharp wail of sirens or the heavy crunch of police cruisers. This was steadier, calmer, and somehow stronger. Dust rose behind the black SUV as it slowed near the gate. Mariah wiped her hands on her apron, her heart pounding, and stepped onto the porch. The door opened, and there he was, her brother. He stepped out with a presence that seemed to command the air itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his posture straight as a soldier's even in civilian clothes. His eyes scanned the farm quickly, taking in every detail. The sagging fences, the barn doors, the patrol car idling far down the road, watching. His jaw tightened, but his face softened the moment his gaze fell on Mariah. "Little sister," he said, his deep voice carrying warmth beneath its steel. Mariah felt tears rise as she hurried down the steps. She hadn't hugged him in years, not since before his last deployment. Now, as his arms wrapped around her, she felt the strength she had prayed for, a shield stronger than anything paper fines or flashing lights could bring. Her children ran forward, shouting, "Uncle!" They clung to him, their small arms wrapping around his waist. He knelt down, ruffling their hair, his serious expression breaking into a smile just for them. "You've grown," he said, his voice lighter, though his eyes still held a weight only Mariah noticed. But the warmth of reunion didn't erase the reality of why he was there. Straightening, he turned back to his sister. "Show me," he said simply. Mariah led him through the farmhouse, pointing out the stacks of finds on the kitchen table, the photos she had taken of officers prowling her land, the letters threatening her livelihood. He listened silently, his face unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't surprised. He had seen power misused before, though usually in places far from home. Now, seeing it here, in his sister's life, fueled a fire inside him that he kept carefully contained. As they stepped outside, the low hum of an engine drifted closer. A police cruiser slowed near the property, the officers inside pretending to look elsewhere, but clearly watching. The veteran's eyes locked on the car. His stance shifted, subtle but unmistakable, his body aligning the way it always had when danger was near. "They've been doing that every day," Mariah said quietly. He nodded once. "Not anymore." The cruiser lingered, but when the officers caught sight of him, his broad shoulders, his steady stance, the unmistakable authority in the way he carried himself, they hesitated. One of them muttered something to the other before the car rolled past, its tires crunching on the gravel. Mariah exhaled shakily. "You didn't even say a word." Her brother's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Sometimes you don't need to." That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with her, organizing the piles of notices and letters. He read each one carefully, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the pattern of harassment. "They want to break you down," he said finally. "Push until you give up the land. But they don't know who they're dealing with." He placed a firm hand over hers. "They don't know you, and they don't know me." For the first time in months, Mariah felt the knot in her chest loosen. She had carried everything alone for so long, but now the weight was shared. Her brother's presence filled the house with a sense of safety, a strength so solid even her children felt it. They laughed more that night, their voices echoing through the farmhouse as he told them gentle stories of faraway places, not the dangerous ones, but the ones with sunsets and strange foods and songs in different languages. Outside, though, the farm remained under watch. Flashing lights appeared again down the road, officers circling like wolves, but they didn't step onto the property that night. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was fear. Either way, the air had changed. Mariah stood on the porch, watching the lights fade into the dark. Her brother stepped beside her, his silhouette strong against the moonlight. "They'll try again," she said softly. "Yes," he replied. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay steel. "And when they do, I'll be here." The farm no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a fortress, not because the harassment had ended, it hadn't, but because she was no longer standing alone. Her brother had arrived, a man shaped by discipline, sharpened by battles, but guided by loyalty and love, and with him there, the fight would no longer be one-sided. Mariah whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, her eyes on the fields that stretched into the night. For the first time in a long time, she believed her farm might survive. Because now it wasn't just hers to protect, it was theirs. The next morning, the farm was unusually quiet, as if the land itself was waiting. Mariah rose early, her boots crunching on the damp earth as she checked the animals, her children trailing sleepily behind. But today, she didn't feel the same dread that usually hung over her like a storm cloud. Today, her brother was there. He was already awake, standing in the yard with his arms folded, scanning the fields and the road beyond. He wasn't restless. He was focused, like a man used to guarding ground more dangerous than this. His presence was steady, like a wall no one could climb. It didn't take long for the police to return. 2 cruisers rolled up the dirt road, their tires grinding the gravel, their red and blue lights flashing even though there was no emergency. Mariah felt her stomach tighten, but her brother didn't move. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the approaching cars. The officers stepped out, their usual confidence on display. One of them smirked, the same way others had so many times before, as he pulled out a clipboard. "We've had more reports," he said, his tone dismissive. "Need to check the property again." Mariah opened her mouth to protest, but her brother lifted a hand, silencing her gently. Then he stepped forward, his boots firm against the ground. "Warrant?" he said calmly. The officers blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." His voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. "If you want to step foot on this land, you bring a warrant signed by a judge. Otherwise, you turn around and leave." The smirk faltered. The second officer straightened his shoulders, trying to sound authoritative. "Sir, this is procedure. We've been called out here multiple times. If you've got nothing to hide—" "Don't finish that sentence," her brother cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. "I've heard it in war zones, in villages where soldiers tried to intimidate family. Say it, and I'll tell you now what I told them then. Rights don't vanish because you wear a uniform." The silence that followed was heavy. Mariah's heart raced, her children clutching her apron as they peered from the porch. For the first time, the officers weren't the loudest voices on the property. Her brother stepped closer, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You've harassed this family long enough. I've read every letter, every so-called violation. None of it holds. You're not here for justice. You're here because you think you can scare a woman raising kids on her own. That ends today." One officer shifted uncomfortably. The other muttered, "We're just doing our job." "Then do it right," he snapped. "Get the paperwork, follow the law, and stop showing up like you own this land, because you don't. She does, and she's not alone anymore." The tension in the air was thick. The officers exchanged glances, their bravado slipping. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had lived through worse than their intimidation. Finally, one of them stuffed the clipboard under his arm. "Fine, we'll be back," he muttered. "Then come back with the proper documents," her brother replied. His voice didn't waver, didn't soften. "Until then, stay off this property." They turned and walked back to their cruisers, their movements stiffer than when they had arrived. The engines roared to life, the tires spitting gravel as they pulled away. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the heavy silence of fear. It was the clean silence of relief, of power shifting. Mariah exhaled shakily, her knees weak. She looked at her brother, who hadn't moved, his posture still strong, his eyes still on the road. "They'll come back," she whispered. "I know," he said, finally turning to face her. "But they'll think twice now, and when they do come back, we'll be ready." Her children ran to him, their small hands tugging at his sleeves. "Uncle, you weren't scared at all," her son exclaimed. He knelt down, his expression softening as he looked at them. "Of course I was," he said honestly. "But courage doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you stand anyway." Mariah's eyes filled with tears. For months she had faced these men alone, her voice drowned out by their authority. But now, with her brother beside her, she saw the truth. Strength wasn't just in survival. Strength was also in standing tall, together. That day marked a turning point. The farm no longer felt like an easy target. The cops could still circle, could still try, but the fear that once silenced Mariah was gone. Her brother had shifted the balance with nothing more than his presence, his words, and his unshakable resolve. And deep down, Mariah knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, victory felt possible.